Welcome, everyone, to this enlightening interview with Jacob Morgan. You already know Jacob because he has been on this channel and he's been everywhere writing a lot about leadership. This time, we are talking to him about his latest book, which is coming up, Leading with Vulnerability. Today, we are here to challenge some of the common leadership stereotypes that have long prevailed in the corporate world. To give you an example, a leader should never apologize. A leader should never show emotions. Leaders should always be strong and confident. They should always take charge, and importantly, they should never be questioned. I got all of them from his book, by the way. So join us to explore how embracing your vulnerability can revolutionize the way we lead and transform our organizations for better. My guest today has been here before, as I said, and he has interviewed over 140 CEOs, spoken, asked them multiple questions about leadership, and that all has come into this book. Jacob, thank you very much for coming again on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What does leading with vulnerability mean?
To me, it's combining two elements, which are leadership with vulnerability, or competence with connection. And I think the big challenge that we see inside of a lot of organizations is we've all heard of vulnerability and we know what it feels like to be vulnerable, but leading with vulnerability is different. And so, originally I was very intrigued with this idea of a lot of people think of vulnerability as just talking about your emotions or feelings, sharing a mistake, a challenge, a struggle, things of that nature. And while there's a lot of benefit and value to doing this in your personal life with friends, with family members, I really started to wonder, is it really just that easy inside of an organization where we have a different dynamic? And furthermore, is it exactly the same if you're a leader who is responsible for the lives of others and the leader who's responsible for managing dollars and cents inside of a business? And a lot of us, what we do is we think of vulnerability, as I mentioned, in terms of talking about a mistake or a challenge or failure or a struggle. And I think if you're a current or aspiring leader, that's actually a dangerous thing for you to do. Instead, you want to add the leadership piece to it. So let me give you one of the stories from the book. And it's the story of Hollis Harris. And Hollis Harris was the CEO of Continental Airlines, which was a struggling airline in the 90s and into the 80s. And Hollis Harris sent out a memo to his entire workforce. And his memo to his 32,000 employees basically said, the business is struggling. I'm not really sure what to do. The best thing that you as an employee could do for Continental Airlines is just pray for the future of the business. That was his message. The next day, he was fired. And this story was told to me by the CEO of American Airlines, Doug Parker. And he said, what Hollis Harris did was vulnerable, but there was no leadership behind it. So consider for a minute if Hollis was Joe in accounting, and he was an employee who's been there for just a few years. He wasn't in a leadership role, and he showed up to work and said, hey, you know what? I think the business is struggling. I'm not sure what to do. I'm having bad feelings. A lot of people would say, why don't you go take a break? Let's go grab lunch, get a coffee. You'll be fine. And that's what would happen if you were a junior employee. But when you're one of the top executives of a team or a function, and you show up and you say that, you're going to cause panic. Now, this is very much opposite to some of the other stories I heard from leaders. And one of them is Fleetwood Grobler, who's the CEO of a company called Sasol. And he too was faced with a very difficult situation. When he became CEO, the company was $13 billion in debt. And this was even before the pandemic started. And he also had to give a message to his entire workforce. And his message was very different than Hollis's. And his message went along the lines of, I understand and acknowledge that we as a business are struggling. I don't know exactly how we're going to get out of this problem, but I have a vision of where I think we can go. And I believe that we can rebuild trust in our customers and in our employees. And if you join me and follow me to help me create this vision and help me figure out exactly how we're going to get there, then I'm confident that we can turn things around and make our business successful. And that's exactly what they did. And that's a very different message, right? What Fleetwood did was he was vulnerable, but he added the leadership piece. And this is, I think, the missing component inside of most organizations, especially for current and aspiring leaders. So kind of a more simple, practical example is you show up to work and you talk about a mistake. And you show up and you say, hey, I'm really sorry. I screwed up. I made a mistake. That's vulnerable, but there's no leadership. Leading with vulnerability would look like this. You would show up to work and I would say, hey, you know what? I'm really sorry. I screwed up. I made a mistake. But here's what I learned from the mistake that I made. And here are the steps that I'm going to take to make sure that that mistake doesn't happen again. That's adding the leadership piece to the vulnerability piece. So that's the difference. And this is what I think we're doing a very poor job of doing inside of our organizations. We use vulnerability as a crutch for poor performance, but we forget that you still also have to be good at your job and demonstrate that you are trying to be good at your job. So that's the difference between vulnerability versus leading with vulnerability.
Yet, vulnerability is linked with weakness, right? When you're sharing some of your deep, emotions or something.
Yeah.
And you did a survey wherein like 50% of people said that the top reason why they don't want to show vulnerability is because they don't want to see being seen as weak.
Yes.
Yes.
So it's funny because you're right. So we surveyed 14,000 employees. And then one of the things that we asked them is exactly that. What's the number one thing that's keeping you from leading with vulnerability at work? Everybody said, well, we don't want to be perceived as being weak or incompetent. And that's interesting, right? So you don't want to be vulnerable and talk about your mistakes or failures because you don't want people to think that you're not good at your job or that you're stupid, for lack of a better word. So the reason why that perception exists to begin with is because we don't lead with vulnerability. We're just vulnerable. So obviously, if you show up to work all the time and you talk about, hey, I'm not feeling great. I'm going through a tough time. I don't know how to do this. I need help. I'm struggling. I made this mistake. If that's all you do and you show up to work, then of course, people are going to look at you and say, hey, you know what? Maybe you're not the right person for this job. Maybe you're not the right leader that we should be having. And people don't want to be perceived as being weak or incompetent because that's exactly what being vulnerable is you're demonstrating weakness. You're demonstrating areas where you're struggling. You're demonstrating areas where you're incompetent. So if you don't want to have that perception, that's when you need to add the leadership piece. So it's kind of ironic because the way that you avoid the perception of being weak and incompetent through vulnerability is to lead with vulnerability. So add that leadership piece to your vulnerability, and that will destroy that perception of you being weak or incompetent. So again, instead of showing up to work and saying, hey, I need help, you're going to show up to work and say, hey, you know what? There are a couple things that I need help with. I'm also investing some of my own time and resources in trying to figure this out. I have a couple of meetings scheduled. I bought a book on this, and I'm going to be taking a course. But can you also give me some of your feedback and guidance and advice on how I should approach this problem as I, go through my learning journey? You admit to a mistake. Again, here's what I learned. Here's what steps I'm going to be taking. So if you want to avoid the perception of being weak or incompetent, you add the leadership piece. One of the CEOs I interviewed is the CEO of Smile Brands. His name is Steve Bilt. And he gave me this analogy. And he said, if you're in ninth grade math, and you keep showing up to ninth grade asking about sixth grade math, eventually your teachers and your students, your peers, they're going to look at you and say, hey, you know what? This is ninth grade, and you keep asking us a lot of questions about sixth grade math. Maybe you should go back down to sixth grade. But if you're in ninth grade math, you show up, you keep asking about sixth grade math, but now you have a tutor. Now you're staying later after school to get some help from the teacher. Now you're spending time at home solving extra math problems and doing things beyond your homework. Now, all of a sudden, you don't have the perception of being weak or incompetent. Now you have the perception of somebody who's trying to solve a problem. Now you have the perception of somebody who's being a leader, somebody who's determined, somebody who's curious, somebody who has grit and resiliency, somebody who's trying to get to the level where they need to be. And that's the important thing. You have to demonstrate that you are doing something or taking some sort of an action to close the gap or to move forward, to create some sort of progress. And that is the area that is lacking for so many people inside of organizations.
So if you have to be vulnerable at work, then be that, but with a plan.
Yes, be vulnerable and add the leadership piece.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, it's okay if you're new in a role and you've never done something before, or maybe you're a first-time leader. But instead of just saying, hey, I'm a leader of a team, I've never done this before, that doesn't instill confidence. That doesn't make people look at you and say, wow, I'm glad you're my leader. Right? Instead, you could say, hey, I'm a first-time leader. I acknowledge and respect that I haven't done this before, but I'm going to be working with a coach to give me some advice and feedback. I'm going to be taking a couple leadership courses to figure out what I can do to be a better leader to you. I'm going to open my doors to get direct feedback from you as employees so that you can tell me what I should be doing. Right? That's different. That's a different approach than just saying, I've never done this before. That's vulnerability. The other one is leading with vulnerability. So yeah, have a plan, have intention, demonstrate what you're doing to close the gap, demonstrate what you're doing to create that forward progress, to move things ahead.
I'm trying to link it with another study, another question that you've asked most of the CEOs, which was, how does vulnerability feels like in your body? And I'm curious to know what exactly they said, but I'm also adding to that is when somebody is just being vulnerable versus being vulnerable with the plan that we just spoke about, will that differ in the biological response? To coming back to your question, how does it feel in your body?
Sure. So I guess let's start with the first question, which is, what does vulnerability feel like? And I was very interested in this question because vulnerability is an uncomfortable thing. Nobody that I interviewed, for example, said, oh, vulnerability feels great and it makes me happy and I get excited and this and that. whenever I interviewed these CEOs, and I would say, what does vulnerability feel like in your body physically? I've had a couple CEOs share that they got panic attacks. I've had CEOs share that it makes their stomach feel queasy. Their heart starts beating. They start sweating. Their palms get sweaty. They don't feel grounded. They feel anxious. They get all these physical manifestations. One CEO said that she starts to feel cold. And so you get a lot of these negative physiological symptoms of vulnerability. And that's because vulnerability is an uncomfortable thing, right? You are exposing yourself emotionally or physically to potentially being harmed. Now, of course, in the case of most people watching and listening, it's more of emotional harm than physical harm, but you're putting yourself out there, which is an uncomfortable thing. And so a lot of almost all the CEOs that I interviewed shared that they get these uncomfortable physical symptoms when they're being vulnerable. So what was the second part of your question?
The second part was when you're just being vulnerable versus when you are having a plan and being vulnerable, the things that we just spoke about. Will that change that physiological response if you're kind of leading with vulnerability?
So the vulnerability piece will always make you feel uncomfortable for almost all people, right? When you have to do or say something that puts you out there, that exposes yourself emotionally, you will always feel uncomfortable. That's just kind of the nature of what vulnerability is. But when you add the leadership piece, it can help offset some of that uncomfortableness. It can help offset some of the negative physiological responses that you're getting by giving you some of that, the confidence, the competence, knowing that you're going to be solving that problem going forward. But does it mean to say that if you have a plan that you add to vulnerability that you're never going to feel uncomfortable? No, you're still probably going to be uncomfortable. You're still probably going to feel weird. You still might get anxiety or stress, because ultimately what you're still doing is putting yourself out there and exposing yourself emotionally in a way where somebody could take whatever it is that you're saying and potentially use it against you if they wanted to. So that part of the equation doesn't change. That part of the equation is not removed. So I think it can maybe help make you feel a little bit better, but I don't think it's gonna, it's not gonna necessarily change the fact that you're feeling uncomfortable or stressed or anxious or anything like that.
And I think it's going to increase some sort of pressure because you're sharing the vulnerability, but at the same time, you're also telling them the plan that this is how I'm going to get rid of this or be better. And then you have that extra pressure to perform.
Yeah.
So even if you are, it may be good, it may be, I don't know, right? But
yeah, I mean, look, like I said, the vulnerability is vulnerability, right? It's not gonna magically go away. But the one thing that does help is knowing that even if things don't go well for you, the worst thing that can happen is that you have a learning moment. Right. So I've interviewed several CEOs for the book, and some of them have shared stories with me of early on in their career where they were vulnerable, they shared, they did something, and people use it against them to try to get them fired, to keep them from getting promoted, to keep them from moving ahead in the organization, to make their life miserable. I have a couple stories like that in the book. And I asked these CEOs, I said, well, did that keep you from being vulnerable in the future? And they said, no. All it did is that it taught me more about myself. It taught me more about being more conscientious and aware of who I'm being vulnerable with and when. And it helped me do it in a better way. So these CEOs, what they realize that is, even if you are vulnerable and it's used against you, you kind of have a few different ways that you can approach it. One way is you could say, well, I tried to be vulnerable before and I got really screwed over. Therefore, I'm never going to be vulnerable again. Or you could approach it and say, you know what? I was vulnerable. It got used against me. But here's what I learned about myself. Here's what I learned about the situation. And here's what I learned about the other person that I can apply going forward in other such situations. That's called having a learning moment. So when you realize that the worst outcome of you being vulnerable and not having it go the way that you wanted it is that you learn something, that should give you more confidence, more safety, more permission, more ability to be vulnerable going forward and not have such a negative stigma attached to it.
So there is also something called, I'm glad you mentioned about this learning movement, and you also have like 3-4 different such movements. One of them is fixed movement, correct? And
yes,
you just alluded to that. And that has happened with me. Just when I was reading the book and I was like, oh man, this has happened, because I have shared a few things when I've given some speeches. There are some incidents that I shared with people to kind of, in the hope that people will learn something from it, but it was very deep secret sort of thing. And then later I realized, gosh, I shouldn't have said that. You know what? I will never do that again. So I didn't do that fixed movement. There are 2 more that you mentioned, right, in the book? Fixed moment,
yes.
movement, and there are 2 more. What are they?
Yeah, there's a breakthrough moment and there's fixed moment. So we have learning moment, which we talked about, fixed moment, which I also alluded to, which is basically this reinforced thinking that you should never do this again. So a fixed moment is I'm vulnerable, it's used against me, and I fix myself in this mentality of, well, that didn't go well, I'm never going to do it again. And then you have breakthrough moments. And breakthrough moments are oftentimes things that are controlled and shaped by somebody else. So this is why when somebody's being vulnerable with you, you have so much tremendous, you have a lot of power and responsibility. So let's say, for example, you share something very personal with me. You're struggling, you're going through something personal, and you share that with me. How I respond to you can dictate how you feel, right? So for example, leading up to, so you want to share something with me, leading up to this encounter that we're going to have together, where you're actually going to sit down and share with me, you're probably going to feel very uncomfortable. You're going to feel stressed. Your stomach might feel queasy. You're going to say, oh man, I got to have this conversation with Jacob in 20 minutes and talk to him about like this big mistake that I made. Like, you're going to feel uncomfortable, and it's going to be very unpleasant leading up to the actual encounter. And then even going through the experience. So let's say you share something with me, something very personal. I mean, who knows what it could be. How I respond to you will dictate whether you have a breakthrough moment or not. A breakthrough moment is kind of a sudden like change in your physiological response. So for example, you confide something in me and I respond back and I say, oh, wow. Yeah, you really shouldn't be in this leadership role after all. Like, I can't believe you did that. That's going to make you feel terrible. Similarly, if you share something with me and I look at you and I say, hey, you know what? That's not a big deal. Like, it's all good. We all make mistakes. Like, you're totally fine. You're not in trouble. Everything's okay. That response that I'm giving you is quickly going to make you feel better. Yeah. And that's what a breakthrough moment is. It's a sudden change where you're feeling negative, bad. Oh, positive. And so who controls that is me, is the person you're being vulnerable with. How I respond to you can dictate whether you get that breakthrough moment or not. So if I respond to you in a way where you feel safe, where you feel compassion, where you feel empathy, where you feel support, your negative physiological response is quickly going to turn positive. You're going to say, wow, that was great. That wasn't so bad after all. Like, I feel supported. I feel like I'm confident. I'm happy I did this. You're not going to still sit there and say, oh my God, things are terrible, this and that. So that's what a breakthrough moment is, right? I mean, I've heard stories, for example, of CEOs who they had to give big presentations in front of a lot of executives, and they felt very vulnerable and scared and uncomfortable. And they see that some of their employees or their peers are in the audience that are like, yeah, you got this, right? They're smiling at them. And all of a sudden they reach that breakthrough point, right? Just seeing their peers smiling at them and giving like the thumbs up or, the fist bump that like, you got this, we believe in you, makes them feel better. So how other people respond to you when you're being vulnerable has a dramatic impact on how you ultimately feel about being vulnerable as well.
So the trick is you need to find out where you're sharing.
Yes, exactly. Right. So if you're sharing, like if I know that you and I are competing for a job and that you're kind of like out to get me and that you're, we're not necessarily on the same page, you don't have my best interest in mind, I probably do not want to be vulnerable with you because it's not going to make me feel good. It's not going to do anything useful or valuable. So it's probably not a good idea to do that. But if I trust you, I know you have my best interest in mind, I know you care about me, then yeah, it probably makes more sense in that situation to share with you and be open with you. So knowing who you're sharing with and who you're being vulnerable with makes a big difference.
The whole problem is because there are some stereotypes about leadership, right? And
yes,
the examples that I read out from your book when we started the interview, and you have a mechanism that you have created, and you've showed that in the book also, is the acronym LEAD, how to break the leadership stereotype. Maybe if you can elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure. So this actually came about because I was writing a lot of satirical articles, and this was over the past like 2 years. And I would write all sorts of funny articles like, don't look your leader in the eye. Nobody cares about your opinion or your feelings at work. And I was writing all these satirical articles about, traditional stereotypes that we have in business. And, I was having a lot of fun with it and realized that a lot of these stereotypes actually still very much exist inside of business. And they still hurt a lot of organizations. They still hurt a lot of leaders and employees. And I thought, well, how do we change these stereotypes around? Right? Some of the stereotypes are like the leader always needs to know all the answers. The leader should never apologize. The leader should not show emotion. I mean, we're familiar with all these stereotypes. So what are some things that you can do to kind of break them? Yeah. And then the book, there's this acronym, as you pointed out, called LEAD, LEAD, which is lead by example. You empower others, you adapt, and then you develop leaders. So leading by example basically means that if you want to break the stereotype, it starts with you, right? If you don't want to be perceived as a leader who never apologizes, if you don't want to be perceived as a leader who only believes in command and control, then don't do that. Don't lead with command and control. Be okay with apologizing, right? Lead by example, and then other people will do that. Second is empower others. If you want people to lead differently, if you want people to think differently, then you need to tell them that it's okay. You need to tell them that it's okay if they challenge you, if they give you feedback, if they go against the grain, if they challenge the status quo, that it's okay to come up with new problems or ideas or solutions to things. Otherwise, they're going to keep doing things the way that they always were doing things. Next is the A, which is adapt. And adapt is really, how do you get out of your comfort zone? It's how do you get out of this mentality of this is how we've always done it like here. This is what it's always been like here. So adapting means actually doing things differently, changing a process, leading in a different way. Whatever it is that you need to do, you have to adapt. And then D is for actually developing leaders. So in my last book, The Future Leader, one of the things that I found is that most people don't actually get into a leadership role until they're maybe in their mid to late 20s. That's on average. Maybe you're a supervisor of a store or whatever it is, but you're responsible for others. But you don't get leadership training until you're in your mid to late 30s, maybe even early 40s. So that means that on average, you could spend between 10 to 20 years leading somebody without ever being taught how to lead, which to me is crazy. So developing leaders means giving people the training, the resources, the tools they need, the mentorship, the guidance, the coaching to become the leaders that you want to see inside your organization. So if you want to break the stereotype, that's what you do. Lead by example, empower others, adapt, and then develop other leaders.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because this similar conversation we had a year and a half ago. And for those who want to know about it, I'll put the link here. When we spoke about The Future Leader, your previous book, which was your fourth book. I have to ask you a question in the end. How do you write so many books in such a short duration? But let's continue with this discussion.
It's not that short. It's like every like 2-3 years, because last book came out 2020, this one 2023. So it's every 2-3 years.
When I asked you, Jacob, what next? You said maybe another book, and I was like, about what? You said, okay, it might be leadership, but what it is, I don't know. And then you have another book now. I was like, wow, that's
yeah. Once I get the idea for it, I like to really jump in and kind of go ahead with it. So
no, but I think the book is really great. It's around 275 pages. A lot of stuff that I came to know was new to me, and it was great to see how you linked vulnerability as a kind of character trait with leadership, which was awesome. And coming back to the interview now, there are some signs that you mentioned. What are the signs that somebody's being vulnerable? So you talk about like many 9, 10, 11 different signs. One of them was listening. I'm curious, how is listening related to vulnerability, number one? And then we want to know more about, what is a good listening is, because majority of people think that they are good listeners.
Yeah.
But the truth is something different. So first of all, tell us how listening is linked to vulnerability, and then let's talk about listening itself.
Sure. So the 10 signs that you alluded to, these are the kind of the 10 common ways that I think a lot of leaders show vulnerability inside of an organization. So listening is a form of vulnerability, because if you think about what listening does, it's you having to be quiet, you having to acknowledge, give somebody else the floor, you having to acknowledge that maybe you don't have all the best ideas or the right answers, you letting somebody else challenge you if needed. And that can be a very vulnerable thing, right? There are a lot of leaders out there who, when you try to give them feedback, they refuse to hear it, right? They don't want to listen. And, like me, for example, I'm pretty quick with certain things. And so, I have a team of 12 people that I work with. And so sometimes for me, listening is very hard, because I feel like I know the answer. I should share it. People should just do what I'm saying. And so sometimes for me, listening is very hard. And it's a vulnerable thing for me to shut up and for me to let other people talk. It's uncomfortable, especially if we're going through like a strategic decision or something that I want to implement. Like it's definitely a sign of vulnerability. And there's a difference between hearing and listening. And what I talk about in the book is that hearing is this unconscious act of letting sound enter your ear, right? Like I could hear birds outside right now. I could hear, my wife in the other room. So hearing is just the unconscious act of letting sound enter your ear. Listening, on the other hand, is very different. Listening is the conscious time and attention required where you pay attention to somebody else. There's a quote that says, there's no greater form of love and respect that you can give somebody than by listening to them. So listening is definitely a sign of vulnerability, letting other people speak, being quiet, focusing on your body language, putting away your devices, asking follow-up conversations. So it's very much a sign of vulnerability that oftentimes we don't acknowledge and pay attention to.
How do you address the default behavior? So when you're listening to somebody and let's say they're sharing a problem with you, and all they want is a pair of ears, really, if there's a word, pair of ears. Anyway, so they just want somebody to listen to them, right? And your default behavior, I think majority of people, especially with me, is to give solution. right? So if they are in some problem and they're sharing that with you, you will be like, oh, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And that breaks the whole conversation. So how, any tips that you can give on how we can become better listeners and stop giving solutions when it's not needed, really?
Well, it depends on the context, right? I mean, sometimes a solution is good and sometimes it's not. So one of the things that I always ask people is I say, do you want my advice? And so somebody will share something with me, for example, a friend, and I'll ask him or I'll ask her and I'll say, do you want to know what I think? Do you want my advice? Do you want to know what I would do if I were in your shoes? And they'll tell me. And they'll say, yeah, sure, let me know what you think. Or sometimes they'll say, yeah, honestly, I just really kind of wanted to share with you and just kind of get it off my chest. And I'll say, that's totally fine. So I always ask people what I can do in that moment to be the better listener. Okay. Now she's going to make a guest appearance on the podcast.
That's better.
So I think that's the best piece of advice is ask other people what you can do to be helpful. Ask if they want your feedback. Ask if they want a solution from you. And then, go based off of that.
Contrary to that, I'm also a mental health ally in my workplace where my job is to listen to people without giving them solutions, even when they're asking for it, because we're not allowed to, we're not trained to do that, right? So that makes the things a little bit more tricky, but we get training for that. So that's a separate story. Okay, coming back to the point of science. There's one more sign that you mentioned. The book is about giving praise and receiving praise. So giving praise and receiving praise, especially receiving praise, how will that make you feel vulnerable?
Well, that's one of the things that we never talk about, right? We always assume that vulnerability is negative, mistake, failure, this and that. But being able to give and receive praise is also a sign of vulnerability. So, for example, if somebody says to you, or if somebody says to me, hey, I really liked your book, or I enjoyed your speech, or that was a great article, or something like that, being able to genuinely accept a compliment and let the other person know that it was a meaningful compliment is a hard thing to do. Oftentimes we'll just say, oh, thanks, like that's great. And that's not very vulnerable. It's just kind of like a polite colloquialism. But letting other people know and showing other people that what they said or did genuinely affected you is definitely a sign of vulnerability because you have to show emotion. You have to put yourself out there. You have to emotionally expose yourself in a certain way. So vulnerability isn't just always about negative and bad things. It can also be about good things too, like giving or receiving praise.
Tell me more about receiving praise.
So same thing, receiving praise, right? It's kind of what I alluded to. Somebody gives you a compliment and you say, you know what? That really means a lot to me. I've worked hard on this and I really appreciate you saying that you enjoyed the book. That means a lot. That's a genuine way of accepting praise that shows emotion and I'm being vulnerable in that moment, as opposed to just saying, hey, thanks, right? That's not a sign of vulnerability. Same thing, giving praise, right? Going up to one of my employees or one of my team members, in an organization and saying, hey, you know what? I just really wanted to let you know that I appreciate the work that you did. You're a very valuable member of this team, and I wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing if it wasn't without your help. Okay. That's a very vulnerable thing to say, instead of just, hey, thanks. So giving and receiving praise can definitely be signs of vulnerability.
How about receiving or not receiving, giving feedback? Because sometimes when you are giving feedback to somebody, although you, from your intentions are pure, you want to give positive feedback, but it is very easy for you to be considered as a critic. How do you differentiate, what is a criticism versus what is a positive feedback?
Yeah, so criticism and feedback are different. I mean, both are obviously can be vulnerable, but asking people for feedback and giving feedback is very vulnerable, right? Think about a performance review. That could be a very vulnerable thing for both people involved. It's very vulnerable for the employee who's being put on the spot and who's trying to demonstrate, why they deserve a raise. It's also very vulnerable on behalf of the leader who now has to uncomfortably challenge the employee and talk about all the different things that they've done well and things that they did wrong. So that's actually one of the most vulnerable things for leaders out there, right? Is getting candid feedback from other people and giving candid feedback to other people. So letting people know when they messed up and actually calling them out on it and telling people when they made a mistake and why. And being able to take that same feedback from other people is very much a huge sign of vulnerability because it's emotional exposure. It puts yourself out there to get unfiltered feedback from other people. Now, this isn't the same type of feedback of uncandid feedback, right? Like if I go to one of my direct reports and they say, hey, how am I doing? And they'll say, oh, great, everything's fine. That's not the type of feedback that I'm talking about. I'm talking about the feedback where if I go to somebody on my team and say, hey, I want to know what I can do better, how I can do better. What's advice or feedback do you have for me? And somebody says, well, Jacob, You tend to be a little disorganized when we're talking about various projects or tasks. Sometimes you can be a little short with us, and maybe you're a little snappy, and it doesn't make me feel good. Like, that's candid feedback. And for me to hear that would be very vulnerable, and for me to ask for that candid feedback is very vulnerable. So again, a lot of people forget that this is a huge sign of vulnerability, assuming that it's candid, and it's not just some kind of like BS feedback that you're getting from someone.
What if it's happening the other way around? Like you are giving feedback to your boss.
Yeah, that can look, vulnerability is a very subjective thing. Some people might find that vulnerable, some people might not find that vulnerable. The whole concept of these 10 signs is these are common signs that somebody is likely or may be vulnerable in that moment. But it doesn't mean that every time you do it, it definitely means you're vulnerable, right? What I find vulnerable and what other people find vulnerable might be different things. I speak a lot. So for me, getting in front of an audience, sometimes it still feels vulnerable, but not always. Whereas for somebody else who's never done that, they might think, oh my goodness, I could never get in front of an audience because that makes me feel very vulnerable. So it's a very subjective thing. But any of these 10 signs can make somebody feel vulnerable, whether you're asking for feedback or giving praise. It's ultimately up to the reader or the person listening or watching this to decide what are their vulnerability signs.
In order to connect with people, I think we show vulnerability and it builds connections, right? And when you are connecting with people, you try to be authentic, which is also one of the signs in your list. When you're being authentic, sometime in order to build that connection and not say something that the other person probably wouldn't like or appreciate, how will you still be authentic? And I don't know if I'm able to phrase it correctly, but
well, you could still be respectful, right? I mean, there's nothing, telling somebody something that they don't want to hear doesn't mean you have to do it in a mean way. I've been given tough feedback by bosses many years ago. I've been given tough feedback from speeches before. I've been given tough feedback from my wife. I've been given tough feedback from friends, people that I work with. It doesn't mean you have to do it in a disrespectful way. I don't need to say, "Oh, you're such an idiot. How could you do this?" You could be authentic and still be respectful of others. So it's not like they're mutually exclusive components.
Okay. So in the later part of the book, you talk about the traits of a vulnerability. I can't even say the word. I really have to practice saying vulnerability. Okay, I'm sharing my vulnerability with you that I can't say the word itself. Anyway, so the 8 traits of a vulnerable leader, and one of them is self-compassion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as a leader, when others are dependent on you, I personally think that it's very difficult to be self-compassionate. How do you deal with that situation? Generally, when you are kind of a provider or looking after people, you want to give as much possible at
Yeah.
your own cost.
Yeah. So being self-compassionate means being kind to yourself.
Hmm.
And this is important because what it does is it gives you a safety net for vulnerability. So one of the people that I interviewed her name is Dr. Anna Bruck. And she pointed out that self-compassion is very important for vulnerability because if things don't go the right way, self-compassion is what allows you to say, you know what, it's okay. Don't beat yourself up over it. You tried. And if you don't have that self-compassion, you're probably going to say something like, oh, you're such an idiot. Why did you do that? Why did you say that? This is why you should never do that again. You don't deserve this. You don't belong here. You start beating yourself up. So self-compassion is very important. It's how you talk to yourself. It's how you treat yourself. It's how you take care of yourself. It's very much related to this concept of self-care. And that is, it helps make it easier for you to be vulnerable when you can speak to yourself and treat yourself in a kind and a positive way.
How do you be better at it?
You just practice. So you pay attention to the voices that you have in your head when you make a mistake. What do those voices look like? For me, those voices used to be like, for example, I play competitive racquetball, I play competitive chess. Whenever I would make mistakes or lose, I would say, oh my God, you're such an idiot. How could you do that? You're such a moron. Now, yesterday, for example, I was just playing in a racquetball tournament and I was playing against one of the best players there who's beaten me many times. And I tried to change the way that I'm talking to myself. And so instead of saying, okay, like, don't screw this up, like, oh, why did you do that? I started saying things like, you know what? It's just a game. Have fun. You got this. Focus. I was being more compassionate and kind to myself, and my mental state changed. And I was able to beat him and beat him by a lot. I beat him 11-3.
Congrats.
And so, and I think a lot of it came down to how, the internal voice that I had in my head and how I was talking to myself. So it's just about practice. It's giving yourself time every day, whether you meditate, whether you eat healthy, whether you exercise, which, I try to do all three. Whether it's changing how you talk to yourself, which is something that I focus on, whether it's looking at your daily gratitudes or things that you appreciate in your life. Whatever it is, you practice it just like any other skill that you have to practice. And then this becomes a part of your daily routine.
Positive self-talk that will
Absolutely.
create
It's huge.
neural
It's huge.
connections.
Yep.
And eventually makes you more self-compassionate. It's really difficult for majority of people to be
It is.
to be
Yeah.
effective of yourself.
Yeah.
People
It's not
often-
easy.
It's not easy. Yeah. I mean, there are a
No.
few things that they sound very easy, but they're actually not.
Yeah. It takes practice.
People don't even realize that they have that problem. You know?
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, great. So how do you motivate leaders to be vulnerable? Because the stereotype is there, and it's, I don't know what's the percentage, but it is quite a lot there, right?
Mhm.
It's the leaders who would they will never share their vulnerability with the people. Yeah. So how do you motivate them to lead with vulnerability?
So my job isn't really to motivate people, right? I mean, what's the quote? You can lead a horse to water, but you can't force it to drink. So I can show people how. I can give people the research, the frameworks, the guidance, but ultimately they need to decide to do it. And so what I like to think that I've done with the book is to paint enough of a picture that shows why this is valuable to them for their careers, why this is valuable to the business, and how to go about that journey. And we live in a different world. We work in a very different world than we did even 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And so it's in your best interest as a leader to adapt. So the messages that I share with everybody else it's about competence and connection. It's about being good at your job and being able to connect with people. And this is something that we all care about, both in our personal and professional lives. So why wouldn't you want to be this kind of a leader? It's the greatest superpower that you can unlock for yourself. So why wouldn't you want to do it?
Great. So you have given a good enough tools in the book to call them out. Like you've given about 8 attributes of a vulnerable leader. You've talked about something called vulnerability wheel and vulnerability mountain. I just wanted, if it's possible, to summarize that for our audience without giving it. It's a lot of things written, a lot of pages written to cover all this. But if you can give a summarized version of how one can become can lead with vulnerability.
Probably the best place to start is this concept of climbing the vulnerability mountain. And the vulnerability mountain is, so anybody who's ever gone hiking or climbing of any kind, you know that at the base of the mountain, it's pretty easy. And then the higher up the mountain you get, the harder it becomes.
Yeah.
So the big piece of advice that I have for everybody is identify what is something that you could do tomorrow, right? What is something simple for you that you could do tomorrow? Maybe it's just talking about what you did over the weekend with the intention of trying to connect with somebody on your team. Maybe it's asking for help with something small and then talking about what you're going to do to figure it out in the future, right? That's something that I could do today, tomorrow, next week. And then what's at the peak of that mountain for you? Something that you can't imagine doing. For example, speaking up in a team meeting and talking about one of your biggest leadership mistakes that you've made. I can't imagine doing that. That just sounds terrifying. So identify what's at the very base of the mountain and what's at the very peak of the mountain. And then what you do is on a regular basis is you climb that mountain. So you did one thing today or tomorrow. What can you do next week, the week after that, or the day after that? And you slowly start to climb that mountain. And I think that's probably the best piece of advice for any leader out there. And to also remember this leading with vulnerability equation. Bring together leadership plus vulnerability, competence plus connection in everything that you do.
How important is competence? Can you still be a good vulnerable leader when you lack a little bit of competence?
Nope. You have to be good at your job. So there's actually a concept called the pratfall effect, which basically states that if you're really good at your job and you're vulnerable, the perception that people have of you increases. So if you're good at your job and you're vulnerable, people then think that you're more likable, that you're even more competent. But if you're not good at your job and you're vulnerable, then that vulnerability reinforces your mediocrity. So the trick here is that you need to demonstrate that you are either good at your job or are trying to get good at your job. You can't use vulnerability as a crutch for competence. There's no substitute for being good at your job. You need to take the steps, to take actions to get good at your job. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what you do, but people are going to wonder why you're in that role if you can't do the role that you're in to begin with. Right? I mean, if I'm a professional speaker and I get up on stage all the time and I keep freezing, people are going to be like, hey, maybe you shouldn't be a speaker. Or if I keep getting up on stage and I say, oh, I had this speech prepared and I forgot what it was, my PowerPoint's messed up and this and that, and the dog ate my homework, people are going to say, maybe this isn't the right job for you. So, you have to demonstrate that you're constantly trying to close that gap. You have to demonstrate your competence, demonstrate that you are creating that kind of forward progress and motion. Because if you don't, eventually people are going to question why you're doing what you're doing.
Is there any example of course, you have interviewed a lot of leaders, but some of the popular leaders are there. Do you know anybody who you can say that like that person always shares vulnerability? Now, the name that is coming into my mind is Elon Musk, but yeah,
Somebody who never shares?
no, who does share and kind of
Oh, who does share? Oh, yeah, there's quite a few. Um, but it's hard without knowing directly, right? So Elon Musk is one of those people. He's an interesting example. Depending on who you ask, some people will say he's either very vulnerable or some people will say he's not vulnerable at all. Because on the one hand, you have him, he shares like everything,
mm,
all of his thoughts he puts up online, all that kind of sort of stuff. Um, but who's to say if it's really something that's making him feel vulnerable? Who's to say how he's actually feeling? Who's to say, like, maybe he's using all of these things as a way to not be vulnerable, to put space and a boundary between him and other people. So you can kind of look at somebody like an Elon Musk in either way. But so Sheryl Palmer, she's the CEO of a home building company called Taylor Morrison. She leads with vulnerability. She shares her emotions with others. She talks about mistakes and failures and struggles, but again, also talks about what she's doing to overcome these things. Hubert Joly, the former CEO of Best Buy, I thought did a very good job of this when he had to turn around the company that everybody thought was going bankrupt. And he too was put in a very difficult position where he had to lead with vulnerability and to say that he understood the business was struggling, to understand that everybody thought he was crazy, that everybody thought the business was going under, and then to say, you know what, my plan, even though all these people think these crazy things, is that I'm going to invest more in training, more in development, more in our people. And here's my plan for how I'm going to turn around the company. Come with me on this journey. So I thought he did a very good job of that too. What's her name? Deb Cupp. She's the president of Microsoft in North America. I think she does a very good job of that. In fact, she has her own podcast. It's called, I forgot what it's called. It's like something Cup of Sunshine or Cup of Coffee with Deb, something like that, where she shares a lot about these conversations publicly as well. So those are some that come to mind.
And guys, if you are interested in leadership, then Jacob has put together lots of such example in more detail and how exactly those leaders did exhibit those characteristics. So it's really worth reading. When exactly is the book coming, Jacob?
So the book is coming on October 3rd. For people who are interested in it, we have a URL that we made for the book called leadwithvulnerability.com. So it's leadwithvulnerability.com. And we also have some pretty cool bonuses if people pre-order a copy, a hardcover copy, and then they just send me the proof of purchase to bonus@thefutureorganization.com. We'll send them some cool stuff. But all of that is available on the website, leadwithvulnerability.com.
Okay, I'll put all of those links in the description of this video. So last time I asked you what next, I'm going to ask you again, what next for the book?
Well, eventually, yeah. So this book isn't even out yet, so I haven't even been thinking about the next one. Right now, I'm in full-on marketing mode, podcast mode, speaking mode, and getting all that stuff out there. But yeah, I mean, eventually there'll be another book, probably in another few years. But as far as what it'll be, no idea yet.
Okay, all the best for that. Jacob, there is one question that I asked you last time and I asked everybody. I'm going to ask you the same question again. Let's see if your answers differ this time. And I'll tell you what your previous answers were. And the question is, what according to you are the top 3 skills that one needs in order to be successful and happy, but schools are not teaching?
Well, for me, that's an easy one, right? I would say the blending of competence and vulnerability, competence and connection. So how can you be vulnerable and demonstrate that you're good at your job and being good at your job? I think those, writing this book really taught me why that is so important for people.
Okay, good. Last time your answers were learning how to learn and emotional intelligence, which links to vulnerability, I guess.
Yeah, very similar response.
And curiosity.
Yeah.
Okay,
funny.
Great. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this interview and I really enjoyed reading the book. Finished it in like 3 days. Really loved it. Took a lot of notes, and those who will read it will really love it. It's got a lot of interesting experiences that people like CEOs have shared. And it's when we're saying CEOs, they're actually very big company CEOs, and the geographical distribution is also like everywhere. You've got people from Australia, from America, from India, Europe, you name the place, and Jacob has interviewed them and given those examples. So I encourage people to grab a copy. I'll put the links and everything. But yeah, Jacob, thank you very much for coming again to the show. I really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Guys, if you've got some value from this, then do not forget to hit that subscribe button and follow me so that you get notification for my next interview. Until then, you take care and keep learning.